Welcome to episode 4. I've wanted to make a video on this particular case for years. I remember years ago checking to see if anyone had ever covered this case on YouTube, and only a handful of channels ever had. Then BuzzFeed Unsolved covered it. I thought we would begin by telling you the story of how I discovered this case to begin with. When I was 16, I went with my mom to see a movie called Changeling. It starred Angelina Jolie and revolved around a single mother searching for her missing son. After I saw the movie, I became aware that the story was based on a real case. I went home and started researching the case. In my research, I came across a list of similar cases. One of these cases involved a little boy named Bobby Dunbar. For some reason, I just felt connected to this case. The case overlaps going into my home state, and the tragedy surrounding the case really struck a nerve with me. Before we get into the case, I thought we would talk about what's going on with our Sims really quickly. So in this episode, I'm going to be building Clara's bakery. I've done something similar to this in Sims 4, but I've never done this in Sims 3. I'm a little bit worried and excited to see how this is ultimately going to turn out, but I've decided to call the bakery Clara's Creations. So a brief recap of what we're doing in the game before we start talking about Bobby Dunbar. Right now, I'm still working on improving Clara's cooking skills before opening her bakery, and it's starting to feel like it's taking forever. We also haven't started the family yet. We'll work on that later. Right now, saving money to improve the house. The house needs a lot of work. I think we covered that in the last episode. But now that I'm actually building Clara's bakery, it won't be long until she's there working and baking yummy things. Now let's get on to the crime. In 1908, Robert Bobby Dunbar was born in Opelousas, Louisiana. When Bobby was 4, his family decided to visit the nearby Swayze Lake. While on that trip, Bobby disappeared. His mother noticed he was missing when her 4-year-old son failed to show up for lunch. A search for Bobby began immediately. When night fell with no sign of the boy, people began searching around the swampy lake known as Swayze Lake. For weeks, people searched the area around the lake for the boy. With no trace of him showing up, people began to wonder if someone had taken Bobby. There was no sign of the boy anywhere, and people started to think maybe he had been kidnapped. The local police began to notify neighboring jurisdictions about Bobby's disappearance, and police throughout the country began searching for young Bobby. After 8 months of searching, investigators found a boy traveling with William Cantwell Walters. William was originally from North Carolina. He was a piano and organ repairman who seemed to spend a lot of time on the road. He was in South Mississippi, in a place called Hub, when he was spotted with a boy that greatly favored Bobby Dunbar. William was originally less than forthright about the boy's identity. When the police questioned him, he gave several answers about who the boy was. He would later state that the boy's name was Charles Bruce Anderson. When the Dunbars learned about the boy, they were initially skeptical. However, they came to Hub, Mississippi to meet him. Bobby's mother, Leslie Dunbar, was initially unsure if this boy was her son. He didn't seem to recognize her at all, but it had been 8 months. In a short amount of time, she became convinced that this boy was Bobby. The boy seemed to have the same moles and scars in the same places as her missing son. William would claim that Bruce was actually the illegitimate son of his own brother and a woman named Julia Anderson. William would claim that Julia had given him permission to take the boy with him as he traveled around the country. Julia would counter this claim. She stated that she'd only given William permission to take Bruce for a few days. She hadn't given him permission to take her son out of state, and now it had been about 18 months since she had last seen her son. A local newspaper paid to have Julia brought to Louisiana in hopes of clearing things up. Julia was shown a lineup of 5 boys and asked to identify which one was her son. She failed to identify him, and the boy found with William didn't seem to recognize her. In the meantime, he had grown close to the Dunbar family. The day after the lineup, Julia was given another chance to spend time with the boy. She became convinced that the boy was in fact her son. People were reluctant to believe her, mostly due to her earlier failure to identify the boy as her son. The press began to vilify Julia, She had had 3 children out of wedlock, and all 3 children were lost to her in a relatively short amount of time. She'd given up 1 child to adoption, another child had died, and the 3rd child had been taken away by William. The issue surrounding the boy's identity was then taken to court. Julia had no money for a lawyer, but still showed up to insist that the boy was her missing son. The judge, however, sided with the wealthy Dunbar family, and the boy would remain Bobby Dunbar. William was then put on trial for the kidnapping of Bobby. After a 2-week trial, William was found guilty of kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison. The conviction would later be overturned on appeal. The state decided not to retry him, and William was allowed to go free. Julia Anderson would later move to Mississippi. While she'd been in Louisiana, she had testified at William's trial. She had become acquainted with some of the other people who were testifying in his defense. These people hailed from Poplarville, Mississippi. The citizens of Poplarville had testified that they had gotten to know William and the boy. They also testified that they had seen William with the boy before Bobby went missing. Julia felt very connected to these people and ended up moving to Poplarville. While there, she would marry and give birth to 7 more children. She would help found a church and become a midwife and a nurse in the small community. Throughout her life, she maintained that the Dunbars had stolen her son. The boy who was raised as Bobby Dunbar was said to have occasionally stopped and visited with the children of Julia Anderson. He supposedly implied to his children that those people were his family. One of Bobby's granddaughters, Margaret Dunbar Cutright, became obsessed with the case. As a child, she would have the story of her grandfather recounted to her over and over again. When she grew up, she decided to research the case. She began reading through the newspapers. She noticed that many newspaper accounts contradicted each other or just didn't make sense. Ultimately, she decided to take a DNA test. Her father's DNA was compared to the DNA of a confirmed member of the Dunbar family. The test proved there was no familial connection. This seems to imply that the boy was actually Julia Anderson's son. Despite offers made from the Anderson family, their DNA has never been compared to the descendants of the man known as Bobby Dunbar. Ultimately, no one knows what happened to the real Bobby Dunbar. Many believe he was probably eaten by a wild animal that day at Swayze Lake. To me, the real tragedy is that of Julia Anderson. Her son disappeared. For over a year, she was separated from him as he traveled with William. When her son was finally reunited with her, he would be ripped away again. He was likely raised by another family who loved him, but I really do think that the man raised as Bobby Dunbar was Julia Anderson's son. This case is deeply sad. The Dunbar family lost a son, Julia lost a son, not to mention that she'd already lost 2 other children. William went to prison for kidnapping Bobby Dunbar, a boy he'd probably never even met. A boy who wasn't Bobby Dunbar was raised as Bobby Dunbar. The descendants of the new Bobby Dunbar have had a hard time dealing with the results of that DNA test. Can you imagine how the Dunbars are feeling? The reason that this case really stuck with me is that Mississippi connection. Having been raised in Mississippi, I was shocked that this case went down so close to my home. And that name, Walters. I'm related to some Walters. When I first heard about this case, those connections really struck a chord with me. This case seemed so real to me. It was more than just words written on a Wikipedia page. That was back in 2008, and all these years later, I still sometimes think about Bobby Dunbar. I also wanted to mention really quickly that Margaret, the granddaughter, she co-authored a book called A Case for Solomon. The book revolves around this case. I think I'd like to pick it up and read it, but I wanted to mention it just in case anyone out there would also be interested in reading it. Okay, so meanwhile with my Sims build here, you saw me struggling to figure out how to get a stove on the lot. I'm pretty sure there's a way to get residential things on a community lot. It seems like I've done that before by just changing the lot like I did here, but obviously that didn't work this time. I don't know, maybe I'm confused. Maybe I didn't actually do that in the past. Anyway, I got Clara to bake some stuff. We're gonna come drop it off at this bakery. Now, obviously I can't actually charge people for these things. This isn't like an actual bakery, but it's kind of a facsimile of one, and it's going to be her little business. I think it looks beautiful. I think it works out great. If you noticed a little skip at one point in the video, I had to look up how to layer objects in this game. I had to look up the cheat codes for it. I also had to look up how to spell enabled because that's part of the little cheat code for that. Regardless, I got everything done. I got some cookies and some cobbler made. I went to the little lot and I dropped them off, and I thought they looked so great sitting there on the counter. I don't know if I'm going to have to make stuff every day for the bakery or not. We'll have to figure that out as we go along. But now we can finally move on to the next step of our playthrough in this game. I also wanted to mention that if you're interested, there's actually a Sims bakery for The Sims 3 that you can buy on the Sims store. It's a little bit pricey, so it wasn't really worth it in my opinion, but if you want it, it does exist. Personally, I kind of want their, they have like a carnival set that I really want to get. Again, it's expensive, but I want it so bad.